The war has a way of compressing the world until only essentials remain: uniforms, orders, borders drawn in chalk and blood. In this narrowed landscape, judgment becomes automatic, delivered with the efficiency of a stamped document. For the woman at the center of this moment, the war has taught her that survival depends not on innocence but on anticipation. She has learned to read faces before words, to recognize the subtle signals that precede cruelty. Long before she encounters the British, she has already rehearsed the shape of her own condemnation. Her life, like so many others caught between advancing fronts and collapsing regimes, has been reduced to movement and concealment. Homes have become temporary, names interchangeable, loyalties assumed rather than chosen. Every encounter with authority has carried the same undertone: suspicion first, explanation later, if at all. The war has erased the luxury of being misunderstood. Misunderstanding now carries consequences measured in imprisonment or worse. She carries this knowledge not as an abstract fear, but as a physical readiness, a tightening of posture and breath that prepares the body for what history has made likely. The British uniforms represent a paradox she cannot resolve. They are not the ones who taught her to fear most deeply, yet they are still soldiers, still agents of a system that decides who is worthy of mercy and who is not. In the chaos of occupation and liberation, distinctions blur. Allies arrive with rifles, and liberation often feels indistinguishable from conquest until proven otherwise. She knows better than to trust appearances. War has taught her that intentions are irrelevant once power is established. As she stands before them, her expectations are not shaped by ideology but by repetition. The pattern has been consistent across borders and languages: questions sharpened into accusations, silence interpreted as guilt, fear mistaken for deception. Even those who claim moral authority have learned to rely on coercion, because coercion works quickly. The war does not reward patience. It rewards control. She assumes she is about to be processed, catalogued, evaluated, reduced to a problem requiring resolution. The weight of this assumption presses inward. It shapes how she holds herself, how she avoids eye contact without appearing defiant, how she prepares to absorb words that will likely wound before any physical harm arrives. Judgment, she has learned, begins long before punishment. It begins in the gaze of those who believe they already understand who she is. In that gaze, individuality dissolves. Context is irrelevant. Only categories matter. Around her, the environment reflects the exhaustion of prolonged conflict. Buildings bear the scars of bombardment, roads are etched with the passage of military convoys, and the air itself feels heavy with residue, smoke, dust, and the unspoken knowledge of what has recently occurred here. This is not a place where tenderness has survived intact. Even compassion, when it appears, does so cautiously, as though afraid of being exposed. The woman's anticipation of cruelty is not dramatic, it is methodical. She does not imagine excess or spectacle. She expects efficiency. War has stripped cruelty of its theatricality and turned it into routine. Orders are followed, procedures enacted, lives altered or ended without ceremony. This is the cruelty she braces for: impersonal, justified, and therefore unstoppable. Her internal narrative has long since adjusted to this reality. Hope has become dangerous, a distraction that can soften necessary vigilance. She has learned to keep expectations low, because disappointment in wartime carries risks beyond emotional pain. Expecting the worst has become a survival strategy, one reinforced by countless examples. Those who expected kindness often paid for it. The British soldiers, in her mind, are not individuals but embodiments of an institution. They carry with them the authority of victory, the confidence of a power advancing rather than retreating. Victory, she knows, brings its own moral hazards. Those who win are rarely required to examine their methods. History tends to validate outcomes rather than processes. She assumes that any understanding she might receive would be secondary to the needs of order and security. This moment, then, is not charged with suspense in the conventional sense. There is no question in her mind about what comes next. The uncertainty lies only in degree, not direction. Will the judgment be swift or prolonged? Will it involve confinement, interrogation, displacement? These are logistical concerns, not moral ones. The moral verdict, she believes, has already been delivered by circumstance. What the war has taken from her most thoroughly is the expectation of being seen as an individual. She does not expect anyone to ask how she arrived here, what compromises she has made, what losses she carries. War has no interest in personal histories unless they can be weaponized. Complexity slows down processes designed for speed. She has learned to compress her own story into silence. This silence, however, is not emptiness. It is dense with memory, the sound of boots on staircases at night, the way neighbors learned not to ask questions, the gradual normalization of fear. It contains the knowledge that moral clarity is a luxury rarely afforded to those without power. She has watched people make choices under duress, then judged later as if those choices were made freely. She has learned that context rarely survives into official records. Standing before the British, she feels the familiar tightening of time. Moments stretch as the body prepares for impact, for the confirmation of what has already been accepted internally. Her anticipation of cruelty is not born of cynicism but of evidence. It is the logical conclusion drawn from years of observation. War has taught her that systems do not pause for introspection, especially when efficiency is at stake. The broader historical forces converge invisibly in this instant. Empires are shifting, alliances reconfiguring, narratives being drafted that will later define heroes and villains. She is aware, dimly, that she exists on the margins of these narratives. Whatever happens to her will likely be reduced to a footnote, if recorded at all. This awareness further reinforces her expectation. Those who are invisible are easily dismissed. There is also a gendered dimension to her anticipation, shaped by the war's particular cruelties toward women. She has seen how vulnerability is often misread as opportunity, how suspicion can slide into violation under the cover of authority. Her fear is layered, informed by stories shared in whispers and by absences that require no explanation. She knows that judgment and cruelty do not always arrive separately. The British understanding, whatever it may turn out to be, is not yet visible to her. At this stage, it exists only as an abstract possibility, one so unlikely that it barely registers. Her mental framework has no space for it. To expect understanding would require believing that the war has not entirely eroded the capacity for restraint. She has learned not to make that assumption. Thus, Chapter 1 closes not with action but with posture, a woman poised within the logic of war, prepared for its familiar verdict. Her anticipation is the product of lived experience, shaped by a world in which cruelty has become predictable and judgment reflexive. In this frozen expectancy, the war's greatest violence is already evident, not in what is about to happen, but in what she has learned to believe must happen. What happens next does not arrive with force, but with absence. The woman waits for the familiar sequence to begin, the tightening of voices, the narrowing of options, the subtle shift from observation to accusation, but it does not come. Instead, there is a pause so unexpected that it feels like an error in the machinery of war. The British soldiers do not advance the moment as she expects. They do not rush to define her, to assign her a role within a predetermined narrative. Time, which has so often been used against her, suddenly stretches in an unfamiliar direction. This hesitation unsettles her more deeply than immediate hostility would have. She has learned how to endure cruelty, she has rehearsed submission, silence, and emotional withdrawal. What she has not prepared for is restraint. The absence of harshness creates a vacuum where certainty used to be, and into that vacuum creeps confusion. Her body remains tense, still operating on instinct, but her mind struggles to recalibrate. War has conditioned her to interpret delay as strategy, kindness as deception. She waits for the hidden angle, the moment when understanding reveals itself as another form of control. The British soldiers appear changed by the very act of pausing. They are no longer merely representatives of authority in her eyes, but individuals caught mid-decision. Their expressions do not carry the sharp efficiency she has come to associate with power. Instead, there is a visible effort to assess rather than dominate. This effort, small as it may seem, disrupts the expected hierarchy of the encounter. For a brief moment, power does not assert itself automatically. The woman senses this shift before she understands it. The usual pressure to perform guilt or innocence, to present herself in a way that might minimize harm, loosens slightly. She does not relax. The war has taught her that relaxation is dangerous. But something in her posture changes. The rigid anticipation of punishment gives way to alert observation. She begins to watch them as carefully as they watch her, searching for cues that might explain this deviation from the norm. This moment exposes the fatigue that has accumulated on both sides of the conflict. The British soldiers are not untouched by the war's moral erosion. Victory has not insulated them from loss, nor has authority shielded them from doubt. Their restraint reflects a weariness that runs deeper than physical exhaustion. It suggests an awareness, perhaps unspoken, perhaps not fully articulated, that the war's justifications have grown thin, that righteousness has been stretched by repetition. In this shared exhaustion, the rigid roles of captor and captive begin to blur. The woman recognizes something in their hesitation that mirrors her own internal conflict. The desire for the ordeal to be over, not just tactically but morally. She has seen how prolonged violence corrodes certainty, how even those who believe in their cause begin to question the cost. This recognition does not create trust, but it creates resonance. The pause also destabilizes the moral simplicity the war depends on. War thrives on clear distinctions, enemy and ally, guilty and innocent, us and them. Understanding, by contrast, introduces complexity. It requires acknowledging that individuals exist within systems they did not design, that choices are constrained by fear and necessity. By hesitating, the British soldiers inadvertently invite this complexity into the encounter. For the woman, this invitation is both dangerous and intoxicating. Complexity has been denied to her for so long that its sudden appearance feels unreal. She has been flattened by circumstance, reduced to a category that justified whatever treatment followed. Now, in this suspended moment, she senses the possibility of being perceived differently. Not absolved, not celebrated, but considered. The difference matters more than she can articulate. The environment seems to respond to this shift as well. Sounds that had faded into the background, the wind moving through damaged structures, distant movement, the faint echoes of a world trying to resume normality, become perceptible again. It is as though the war's relentless noise has briefly receded, allowing quieter realities to surface. This sensory reawakening underscores how deeply the conflict has numbed perception on all sides. Yet the woman does not allow herself hope. Hope, she knows, can be weaponized. She has seen how moments of apparent kindness can precede greater harm, how understanding can be withdrawn as quickly as it is offered. She remains aware that the balance of power has not changed. The soldiers are still armed, still authorized, still capable of enforcing decisions that will reshape her life. The pause does not negate that reality, it merely complicates it. This complication, however, has consequences. It forces the soldiers to confront the humanity in front of them before acting upon it. Even if this recognition is fleeting, it leaves a trace. Actions taken after reflection carry a different weight than those executed automatically. The war's violence has often depended on speed, on preventing thought from interfering with orders. Here, thought intrudes. For the British soldiers, this intrusion may not feel noble. It may feel inconvenient, even risky. War teaches that hesitation can be deadly. Yet the very fact that they hesitate suggests that something within them resists the complete surrender of moral agency. They are not merely following procedure, they are, consciously or not, questioning it. The woman senses this internal conflict without fully understanding its source. She sees it in the way their attention shifts, in the absence of immediate commands. This observation creates a fragile connection, not of trust but of shared vulnerability. Both sides are exposed by the pause. She, because her expectations no longer guide her. They, because their authority is momentarily unshielded by routine. This shared exposure freezes the encounter. Movement feels premature, speech risky. The war has trained everyone involved to fear deviation. Yet deviation has already occurred. The moment stretches, suspended between what usually happens and what might happen instead. In this suspension, the woman experiences a rare sensation, not safety, but possibility. Possibility is unsettling precisely because it demands engagement. Endurance requires only submission. Possibility requires choice. The woman feels the weight of this demand even as she remains outwardly still. If understanding is genuinely being offered, however tentatively, it may require her to respond as more than a passive subject. She may be seen, and being seen carries its own risks. This is the moral reversal at the heart of the moment. The war has conditioned her to expect cruelty as the first language of power. Here, understanding speaks first, not loudly, not decisively, but unmistakably. Its very quietness gives it force. It disrupts the narrative she has constructed to survive, a narrative in which mercy is rare and always conditional. For the soldiers, this reversal may not feel like an act of compassion so much as an act of restraint. Yet restraint, in a war defined by excess, becomes radical. It challenges the assumption that authority must assert itself through dominance. It suggests that control can be exercised through listening, through delay, through the refusal to immediately categorize. The freezing of the moment is therefore not merely physical. It is ethical. Both sides are caught between the momentum of history and the immediacy of human encounter. The war presses forward, demanding resolution, but the present resists being rushed. In this resistance, something fragile takes shape, not peace, not reconciliation, but recognition. Chapter 2 closes within this suspended space, where expectations unravel and certainties weaken. The woman remains unsure of her fate, but she is no longer certain of her condemnation. The British soldiers remain agents of power, but they are momentarily aware of the weight of that power. Nothing decisive has happened, yet the moral landscape has shifted. The pause itself becomes an event, a quiet rupture in the war's relentless logic, proving that even in the midst of conflict, understanding can intrude, uninvited, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. The pause does not resolve itself quickly. Instead, it deepens, stretching into a space where unspoken histories begin to surface. In this prolonged stillness, the woman becomes acutely aware that the encounter is no longer governed solely by external authority but by internal reckonings unfolding on both sides. The British soldiers, who moments ago embodied the certainty of command, now appear weighed down by something less visible but more burdensome, the accumulation of moral fatigue. This fatigue is not sudden. It has been building quietly through months of operations, through towns entered and left behind, through faces that blur together in memory. War, even when fought under banners of liberation, exacts a cost from those who enforce it. Each decision made under pressure leaves a residue, and over time that residue dulls conviction. The soldiers' hesitation reflects an awareness that their actions no longer exist in isolation. They are part of a long chain of cause and consequence that has grown increasingly difficult to justify with simple language. The woman senses this, though she cannot name it directly. She has seen similar expressions before, usually in those who have witnessed too much to remain fully convinced of their own righteousness. It is an expression marked by restraint, not because restraint is ordered, but because excess has become intolerable. In this recognition, the encounter shifts again. The soldiers are no longer just arbiters of her fate, they are participants in a shared exhaustion. This shared exhaustion destabilizes the moral framework the war relies upon. Victory and defeat, guilt and innocence. These binaries require energy to maintain. They depend on belief, on the willingness to simplify reality for the sake of action. But prolonged conflict erodes that willingness. Complexity seeps in, uninvited, forcing itself into moments that were supposed to be procedural. For the woman, this erosion feels strangely familiar. She has lived within complexity for years, navigating compromises that history will later judge harshly without understanding the constraints under which they were made. She has learned that survival often requires decisions that do not fit neatly into moral categories. Seeing this same ambiguity reflected in those with power unsettles her assumptions. It suggests that certainty is not as evenly distributed as she once believed. The soldier's restraint reveals not only fatigue but doubt. Doubt about the completeness of the narratives they have been given, doubt about the effectiveness of force as a moral instrument. They have seen what happens when suspicion becomes default, when fear dictates policy. Towns emptied, lives displaced, trust destroyed in the name of security. These outcomes linger, even when officially framed as necessary. In this moment, the woman becomes a focal point for these accumulated doubts. She is not just an individual standing before them, she is a reminder of how easily people become collateral in larger strategies. Her presence challenges the abstraction of the enemy. She does not conform to the simplified image that justifies swift judgment. Her fear is visible, but it is not the fear of guilt exposed. It is the fear of someone accustomed to being misread. This misreading has defined much of her wartime existence. She has learned that fear itself can be incriminating, that silence can be interpreted as defiance, that explanation can be twisted into contradiction. The war has trained everyone involved to distrust nuance. Yet here, nuance refuses to be ignored. It presses into the silence, demanding acknowledgement. The soldiers, confronted with this demand, cannot easily retreat into procedure. The pause has already broken the spell of automatic action. To move forward now requires conscious choice. They must decide not only what to do with her, but what kind of war they are willing to continue fighting. This decision may be small in scale, but it is immense in implication. The woman feels the weight of this deliberation even as she remains outwardly still. She understands, intuitively, that the danger has not passed. Power remains asymmetrical. Yet she also understands that something irreversible has occurred. The moment of hesitation has exposed the humanity on both sides, and once exposed, it cannot be fully concealed again. This exposure brings discomfort. For the soldiers, it complicates their role. Authority functions best when it is unquestioned, when actions are justified by hierarchy rather than reflection. Doubt undermines that efficiency. It introduces vulnerability, the possibility of error, the risk of regret. Yet it also introduces responsibility. Actions taken after doubt cannot hide behind ignorance. For the woman, being seen as human rather than category brings its own burden. Humanity invites judgment of a different kind, one that considers motives, circumstances, and consequences. She has survived by avoiding such scrutiny, by remaining opaque. Now, opacity is no longer her shield. She is visible in a way that feels both relieving and terrifying. The freezing of the moment intensifies this tension. Time seems suspended not because nothing is happening, but because too much is happening internally. Memories surface unbidden. For the soldiers, faces of civilians who did not fit the enemy profile but suffered anyway. For the woman, past encounters where mercy was promised and then withdrawn. These memories inform their present caution. This shared stillness becomes a mirror. Each side sees reflected in the other a version of themselves shaped by the same conflict. The soldiers see someone whose life has been constrained by forces beyond her control, much as their own choices have been constrained by orders and expectations. The woman sees individuals who, despite their authority, are not immune to doubt or regret. The war's moral exhaustion is laid bare in this mutual recognition. It is not dramatic or cathartic. It does not resolve into forgiveness or solidarity. Instead, it manifests as a heavy awareness that the war has demanded too much from everyone involved. That awareness hangs in the air, unspoken but undeniable. In this state, the usual justifications feel inadequate. Words like duty and necessity lose their sharpness. They sound rehearsed, insufficient to account for the lived reality of those standing here now. The soldiers may still believe in their cause, but belief no longer translates seamlessly into action. It must pass through reflection first, and reflection slows everything down. The woman experiences this slowdown as a fragile reprieve. She does not mistake it for safety. She knows that reflection can end abruptly, overridden by command or fear. Yet even a temporary reprieve alters her internal landscape. It challenges the inevitability she has carried for so long. If cruelty is not automatic, then perhaps it is not as inevitable as she believed. This realization is subtle but profound. It does not erase her fear or undo her experiences. Instead, it introduces a crack in the narrative that has governed her survival. Through that crack, alternative possibilities become faintly visible. They are not guarantees, but they exist nonetheless. The soldiers, too, are altered by this crack. Having acknowledged complexity, they cannot easily return to unthinking enforcement. Even if they proceed with authority, the memory of this pause will linger. It will complicate future decisions, making it harder to dismiss individuals as mere extensions of the enemy. Thus, the moment remains frozen, suspended between action and inaction, certainty and doubt. It is a moment defined not by what is done, but by what is consciously withheld. In the context of war, withholding can be as significant as action. It represents a refusal to let momentum dictate morality. As the encounter continues to hover in this unresolved state, the broader implications become clear. This is not just an isolated interaction, it is a microcosm of the war's deeper struggle. Not the struggle between armies or nations, but the struggle within individuals to retain moral agency amid systemic violence. The woman stands within this struggle, no longer merely anticipating judgment, but witnessing its hesitation. The British soldiers stand within it as well, aware that understanding has already spoken, and that its voice, however quiet, cannot be unheard. In this shared awareness, the war's moral exhaustion is fully revealed, not as defeat, but as a reckoning that neither side can escape. The stillness that follows does not dissipate, it thickens. What began as a pause now settles into something heavier, a suspension that feels deliberate even if no one has consciously chosen it. The woman becomes aware that time itself seems altered, no longer rushing her toward an outcome but holding her in place, as if insisting that something unresolved must be faced before anything can proceed. This frozen interval is not empty. It is crowded with meaning, with implications neither side is ready to articulate. In this suspended space, judgment itself begins to change shape. The war has taught everyone involved to expect judgment as a blunt instrument, swift and definitive. It arrives with accusations already formed, with conclusions drawn in advance. Here, however, judgment is delayed, and in that delay it becomes something else entirely. It turns inward. It begins to question its own legitimacy. The woman senses that she is no longer merely the object of judgment, but its catalyst. For the soldiers, this delay forces an uncomfortable reckoning. They are trained to act, to resolve uncertainty through decisive movement. Yet now they are confronted with a moment that resists resolution. To move forward without reflection would feel like a betrayal of something newly acknowledged. They are not frozen by fear, but by awareness. Awareness that what they do next will not simply affect one person's fate, but will define the kind of authority they embody. The woman feels this shift acutely. The familiar weight of being evaluated, categorized, and dismissed has not disappeared, but it has lost its inevitability. She stands in a space where judgment has not yet hardened into verdict. This is unfamiliar territory. She has lived under systems where judgment was immediate and final, where explanations were irrelevant once suspicion took hold. Now, the absence of immediate condemnation creates a strange pressure of its own. This pressure is not relief, it is exposure. Without the certainty of cruelty, she cannot retreat into the emotional armor she has perfected. She cannot simply endure. She must remain present, alert to nuances she once learned to ignore. The silence stretches, and within it she becomes aware of her own humanity resurfacing, something she has suppressed for survival. This resurfacing is both painful and dangerous. The frozen moment forces memory to intrude. The woman recalls past instances when judgment was swift and unyielding, doors kicked open, names read from lists, accusations delivered without room for response. In those moments, there was no ambiguity, no hesitation. The cruelty was predictable, almost reassuring in its consistency. What she faces now is less predictable, and therefore more unsettling. For the soldiers, memory intrudes as well. They recall orders followed without question, operations executed with efficiency that left little time for reflection. They remember moments when hesitation might have altered outcomes, when individuals were reduced to threats because it was simpler that way. These memories do not accuse them directly, but they linger, demanding acknowledgement. The pause gives them space to surface. In this shared recollection, the encounter becomes a mirror of the war's deeper moral crisis. The conflict has demanded obedience and speed, often at the expense of conscience. Yet conscience has not vanished. It has merely been suppressed. In this moment of stillness, it resurfaces, insistent and uncomfortable. The war's momentum falters as moral questions assert themselves. The woman recognizes that the soldiers are grappling with something larger than her immediate fate. She sees it in their stillness, in the absence of the usual signals that precede command. This recognition alters her own internal posture. She is no longer solely focused on minimizing harm to herself. She becomes, however briefly, aware of the broader human struggle unfolding around her. This awareness does not erase fear. Fear remains, rooted in experience and reinforced by history. But it is now accompanied by a cautious attentiveness. She begins to observe not just what might be done to her, but what is being withheld. The withholding itself becomes meaningful. It suggests that cruelty is not the only option available, even if it has been the most common. The frozen moment also exposes the fragility of moral authority. Authority relies on the perception of certainty, on the belief that decisions are justified and necessary. When authority hesitates, it reveals its human core. This revelation can be destabilizing. It invites scrutiny, questions, and the possibility of alternative choices. The soldiers feel this instability, even if they do not articulate it. For the woman, witnessing this instability challenges her long-held assumptions. She has learned to see power as monolithic, unresponsive to individual circumstance. Now, she glimpses its vulnerability. This does not make power less dangerous, but it makes it less abstract. It becomes something exercised by people rather than systems alone. This realization complicates her fear, introducing a reluctant empathy she has trained herself to avoid. The war has not prepared her for empathy toward those who hold power over her. Empathy, she knows, can blur necessary boundaries. Yet in this moment, empathy arises unbidden, born of recognition rather than forgiveness. She sees not saviors or villains, but individuals constrained by roles they did not fully choose. This recognition does not excuse past actions, but it reframes the present encounter. The stillness intensifies as neither side moves to break it. The environment seems to hold its breath. The sounds of war feel distant, as though muffled by the weight of the moment. This sensory quiet amplifies the internal tension. The absence of action becomes conspicuous, demanding interpretation. What does it mean when judgment pauses? What does it reveal about the nature of cruelty itself? Cruelty, the woman realizes, is not only an act but a habit. It thrives on repetition and justification. It becomes easier when it is expected, when no one questions its necessity. In this frozen moment, expectation has been disrupted. Cruelty has not been enacted because understanding, however tentative, arrived first. This inversion feels radical precisely because it is so rare. The soldiers are aware of this inversion, even if they do not name it. They feel the weight of choice pressing down on them. To proceed with cruelty now would require effort, a conscious decision to override the understanding that has already surfaced. This awareness introduces accountability. It strips away the comfort of inevitability. Whatever happens next will be owned, not merely executed. The woman senses this accountability and feels its implications ripple outward. If cruelty requires choice, then restraint is also a choice. This realization alters the moral landscape she inhabits. It does not guarantee safety, but it restores a measure of agency to all involved. Agency, once acknowledged, cannot be entirely denied again. As the moment remains frozen, the war's broader narrative intrudes. Victories are being claimed elsewhere, lines are being redrawn, histories written that will simplify complex realities into digestible stories. Yet here, in this small, suspended encounter, simplification fails. The reality is too immediate, too human to be reduced to slogans. The woman stands as evidence of this complexity. Her existence defies easy classification. She embodies the gray zones the war prefers to ignore. In delaying judgment, the soldiers are forced to confront these gray zones, to acknowledge that the war's moral map is incomplete. This acknowledgement does not resolve the conflict, but it undermines its absolutes. The freezing of the moment thus becomes an act of quiet defiance against the war's logic. It resists the demand for speed and certainty. It insists on presence, on seeing before acting. This insistence is fragile and temporary, but it matters. It demonstrates that even within systems designed to suppress reflection, reflection can still emerge. For the woman, this moment imprints itself deeply. Regardless of the outcome, she will remember that cruelty did not speak first. That understanding, however brief, interrupted the expected order of things. This memory will complicate her future expectations, making it harder to accept inevitability without question. For the soldiers, the moment will linger as well. It will join other memories that resist neat categorization, moments that challenge the narratives they tell themselves about duty and righteousness. These memories may not change the course of the war, but they will shape the individuals who carry them forward. The stillness eventually begins to strain under its own weight. Frozen moments cannot last indefinitely. The war presses on, demanding decisions, resolutions, movement. Yet even as the pressure builds, something fundamental has shifted. Judgment has been delayed long enough to be examined. Cruelty has been withheld long enough to be questioned. In this examination, the war's moral cost becomes unmistakable. It is not only measured in lives lost or cities destroyed, but in the erosion of certainty, in the burden of choices made and unmade. The frozen moment exposes this cost with stark clarity. It reveals that the true struggle of the war is not only external, but internal, a struggle to retain humanity amid forces that reward its suppression. As the encounter approaches its next phase, whatever that may be, the woman and the soldiers remain bound by this shared moment of suspension. They have seen something they cannot unsee. Understanding has spoken, and in doing so, it has altered the terrain on which judgment will fall. The freeze is not an ending, but a threshold, one that marks the point where the war's moral simplicity gives way to a more difficult, more honest reckoning. When the stillness finally begins to loosen, it does so unevenly, as if the moment itself resists release. The woman feels the shift before she can identify its cause. It is not a command or a movement, but a subtle change in atmosphere, a sense that the suspended judgment has reached a point where it can no longer remain abstract. Something must follow understanding, even if that something is uncertain. The weight of what has been withheld now presses forward, demanding consequence. For the woman, this transition is more destabilizing than the anticipation of cruelty ever was. Endurance had become a skill, honed through repetition. She knew how to absorb hostility without responding, how to retreat inward and survive the encounter by becoming smaller, quieter, less visible. Understanding, however, offers no such script. It does not allow her to disappear. Instead, it places her in a position where her existence must be acknowledged, where her presence requires engagement rather than suppression. This engagement feels dangerous precisely because it restores her to herself. For so long, survival has depended on emotional detachment, on reducing her own story to something manageable, something that could not provoke scrutiny. Now, with cruelty delayed and judgment unsettled, she becomes aware of her own complexity resurfacing. Memories, motivations, losses, elements she has learned to bury, press closer to the surface. They threaten to make her legible in ways she has avoided. Understanding demands response, even if no words are spoken. It demands a posture different from resignation. The woman feels this demand acutely. She is no longer simply bracing for impact. She is being positioned, however subtly, as a moral participant in the moment. This is an unfamiliar role. War has taught her that participation is dangerous unless one holds power. Yet here she is, implicated not as an object but as a presence whose meaning must be reckoned with. The soldiers feel the shift as well. The pause they initiated, whether consciously or not, has altered the terms of the encounter. By withholding immediate judgment, they have taken on a burden they cannot easily discard. Understanding, once extended, creates obligation. It requires consistency. To retreat into cruelty now would not feel like procedure. It would feel like betrayal of the moment, of themselves, of the fragile recognition that has already occurred. This obligation weighs heavily. The soldiers are aware that mercy, once exercised, reshapes identity. It forces those who grant it to confront their own capacity for choice. They can no longer hide entirely behind orders or abstractions. Even if the outcome remains harsh, it will now carry the knowledge that an alternative existed. That knowledge cannot be erased. For the woman, this realization introduces a new form of vulnerability. She understands that mercy, if it comes, will not erase the past or guarantee the future. It will not restore what has been lost or shield her from what may yet come. Yet its presence alters her internal narrative. She is no longer defined solely by what has been done to her, but also by what has been withheld. This distinction, subtle as it is, matters profoundly. She feels the emotional weight of this distinction settling into her body. It is heavier than punishment because it cannot be endured passively. Punishment allows for numbing, understanding does not. Understanding keeps the senses alert, the mind engaged. It invites reflection at a time when reflection has been a liability. She becomes aware of how much of herself she has silenced to survive, and how difficult it is to remain silent now. The soldiers, too, confront the cost of engagement. Their restraint has opened a space where doubt and empathy coexist uncomfortably with authority. They are reminded that power exercised without reflection is simpler, cleaner. Reflection complicates everything. It introduces hesitation, second-guessing, the possibility of regret. Yet it also restores a sense of agency that pure obedience erodes.